Hello and welcome to today's tutorial on the SoftLayer API. My name is Christopher Gallo and I'm the Senior API Developer here. I'm responsible for maintaining the API documentation in our API open source libraries. And today we're going to talk about an API concept called object masks. An object mask is basically an array-like string that's used to select properties to be included in the response of an API request. And the format looks something like this. We start off with this mask keyword, which is required, and we open up a square bracket to start our array of properties. So we got property 1. Property 1 can have itself some properties, so we open up an array. We say nested property 1, nested property 2, which this one itself could have more properties, so we say an array here, and a really nested property. We close out our arrays, add a comma, a new property 2 and property 3. And again, close out the object mask. All these properties can usually themselves have sub-properties if they're relational, but not specifying the properties lets the API return its default selection for you. So for property 1, we're saying nested 1, nested 2, really nested. These are all going to be included. But for property 2 and 3, any sub-properties for those, the API will choose its defaults for us. And when sending all of that into the API, the actual string itself will look something like this. Generally, you want to take out any spaces to make URL encoding it a little easier. Some basic concepts. First, we got data types. A data type represents a table in a SQL database, more or less. The starting data type for an object mask is going to be the return type of a method, and we'll talk specifically about how to find that in the documentation in a moment. Data types will have two types of properties. Local properties. These are going to represent columns in the table the data type represents. Adding a local property to an object mask removes all the default properties from the return data. And you will want to do this to control how much data is returned by the API, because this will deselect a bunch of the default return data that you might not care about. Relational properties. These are going to be properties that exist in foreign tables that relate to this piece of data. When you add a relational property, think of it as adding a join clause to the SQL select statement that's being executed when you get this data back. And so adding a lot of relational properties can make your SQL query take a long time to resolve. So that's one thing to think about when you're adding properties to an object mask. How many relational properties are you adding? How many different relationships are you pulling in? So object mask control which properties are added to the SQL select and join clauses. So here's an example of that. So we're going to use the SLCLI to make a basic API request. We want the return data in JSON format. We're going to say call API, SoftLayer account, get object, which is one of the more simple API methods. We're going to specify an object mask here. We start off with the keyword mask with our bracket. We're going to say ID. So this is going to be an account ID, the account company name, the account's virtual guest, and the virtual guest's ID and host name. And this is going to generate a SQL statement that looks something like this. So we're going to select account ID, account company name, virtual guest ID, virtual guest host name from account. And we're going to join in virtual guest on virtual guest ID, virtual guest account ID equals account.id, and where account ID is your active user's ID. And that's not the exact SQL that gets generated, but that should give you a basic idea of what is happening behind the scenes. And for me, that helps me understand better what's actually going on in the API when I'm adding all these object mask concepts. So step 1, we got to find the data structure for our base object mask. In this example, we're going to call SoftLayer virtual guest get object. And we can find the data type because its optional header has an object mask, and it's going to be SoftLayer virtual guest object mask. So the SoftLayer virtual guest is our data type. And this is matching up with our return value as well. Not all methods take in object masks, so it's important to look for this header here. If it does not have an object mask header, you cannot send an object mask into that request. So step 2, we're going to find properties that we want to add to our object mask. So here's the SoftLayer virtual guest data type. So for example, we're going to say we want the local properties create date, host name, and ID. Since these are local properties and we added them to our object mask, none of these other default local or relational properties are going to be added. But we will select one relational property, allowed network storage, just to kind of show you how that works. So all of these properties are on the same level as the SoftLayer virtual guest data type, right? And what I mean by that is that they're all on the level 1 of the array, for example, right? We have no more open brackets anywhere in here. These are all just directly SoftLayer virtual guest properties. So let's see what that looks like. So when we use the SLCLI to call the API, we do SoftLayer virtual guest, get object, specify the ID that we want, and our mask that we mentioned earlier. And the response will look something like this. On our first level, we have hostname, ID, allowed network storage, as we requested. And that's it for the virtual guest object. There's no other default properties because we specified some local ones first. However, allowed network storage is a little different. It's a relational property. And here we see we have the default properties selected by the API. And so step 2, we can find some more properties. As I mentioned, allowed network storage is a relational property, so we can select properties from that level. Allowed network storage is a SoftLayer network storage data type, and we can select properties here. So for example, we might select capacity gigabytes, ID, and not pictured here is the billing item property that we're going to also select. So to do that, on allowed network storage property, we open up an array with the bracket, specify ID, capacity, billing item, and close that bracket out. So here's what that API request would look like. Again, just like the last one, same basic setup, except this time we have allowed network storage and our ID, capacity, billing item. The result again, so on allowed network storage, we've got our billing item, which has all its default properties. But all the other allowed network storage properties that we saw earlier are now gone because we specified the 2 local properties, capacity GB and ID. So we can keep going because billing item is a relational property itself. We can go into the SoftLayer billing item data type, and we can select even more properties. Here we're going to select ID, hours used, and notes. So the mask, again, getting quite long this time. So we've got the virtual guest level. Allowed network storage goes into a level deeper. We got those properties. Then billing item has its own level in and of itself. And the result is just this. Since billing item, all 3 of these are local properties, we only get those properties in our billing item. And this has let us greatly reduce the size of our API payload because we selected all those local properties. And now our API response only has properties that we care about. So here's how you would specify that in an XML example. So in the header, you'd have the SoftLayer object mask header. You'd have a member, its name would be mask, and its value would be the string, just like we had before. So basically the same thing. We've got our header area, our object mask header, and we got our mask string. With SOAP, you can actually specify the object mask as a SOAP object, but that gets a lot more complicated and was not something I wanted to get into in these examples. Just know that it is something you can do, although you will likely need a proper SOAP library to deal with it. And the only SOAP library that we really have is the PHP SOAP library to use. In general, I find it simpler to use the mask format as it behaves almost exactly the same as if you were had to specify each property in the SOAP object itself. So some warnings about object masks. Object masks are very powerful, but it does allow you to shoot yourself in the foot if you're not careful. So for example, what I mean by that, here's some kind of strange object mask that you wouldn't normally do, but it highlights the danger here. So for example, most data types link back to the account data type, which the account data type lets you link back into almost every area of the API. So you can make some really weird object masks this way. So for example, if we were going to call SoftLayer virtual guest get object, we might specify our mask with our ID, our host name, and maybe one our account. And from the account, we can specify invoices. That'll give us all of our invoices for the entire account as a response to our virtual guest get object request. And so when we do this request, it turns out our response gets up to 5 megabytes, and that's just with the invoice property, right? Without it, our response would only be a few kilobytes, if that. So as a general rule, make sure to understand what your object mask is doing and have a limited object mask as much as you can. So you also have to worry about getting too many objects, as that can result in internal server errors and other issues for you. Some of the default properties themselves can query too much data if you're just making a simple API request. So for example, here we have SoftLayer account, get all billing items. Here, we're not even specifying an object mask at all. We're just doing the default. The default, because my account is quite old and has quite a lot of billing items, I get an internal server error right away. And this is because on my account, I have 128,000 billing items. And each of these billing items is going to, by default, have other relationships that it's pulling in. And this is just too much for the API to handle, so you get this internal error. A way to fix that is to trim down your object mask. Here's the same API call, but this time I specify the object mask, and I'm just getting the ID of all my billing items. This request is able to succeed because even though it's querying 128,000 items, it's only getting the ID back, which SQL can do quite quickly. One trick you can do with object mask is what's called type casting. So the SoftLayer account get hardware API call, it returns a SoftLayer hardware object, which is generally fine. However, most of the objects that get returned are actually SoftLayer hardware server objects, which has most of the same properties because SoftLayer hardware server inherits from SoftLayer hardware. However, SoftLayer hardware server has some additional properties that you might need when you call SoftLayer account get hardware. So for example, VMware servers provisioned by IBM Cloud are able to have some of the basic information about them queried through the API, like the virtual guest on them and that sort of thing. So the SoftLayer hardware server class has a property called virtual guests. However, the SoftLayer hardware class does not. So if you were to call SoftLayer account get hardware with a virtual guest property, you get an error that looks something like this. Property virtual guest not valid for SoftLayer hardware. So to get past that, what you need to do is typecast your object mask. And you do this by specifying mask. You open up some parentheses and put the data type that you want to cast it to in here. So same basic API calls we were doing earlier, but this time we're casting it to SoftLayer hardware server, and then we get our results back, as you'd expect. So this is also useful for the SoftLayer search service or any other service that returns multiple child classes for a base class. So SoftLayer billing item is one such example. So if you were getting your invoice data back, your invoice will have a lot of billing items, and those billing items can have a lot of child subclasses that have properties the base billing item does not. So I'll give you an example with the SoftLayer search service. So we want to do SoftLayer search. We're going to specify these two object types. So SoftLayer hardware, SoftLayer virtual guest, and we want to get anything that has test.com in it. And our response is going to look something like this. So we got our match terms, we have a property called resource on each one. And the resource is going to be in this case, it's virtual guest for both. But it could be virtual guest and SoftLayer hardware, for example, if it was. And the resource itself will be that type. So you can add in properties to an object mask this way. The trick is the SoftLayer search service, it returns the SoftLayer container search result data type. So for example, if you wanted to get the ID and host name of your virtual guest and hardware, you could not do that directly because the SoftLayer container search result data type does not have those properties. The solution is going to be typecasting, and this is going to be a little different. So we have our mask, which is just a normal object mask. We're going to open it up. We're going to specify the resource property that matches here. But this resource, we're going to cast to SoftLayer hardware. I'm going to say ID and host name. We're going to do it again for the virtual guest resource and say ID and host name. And you're going to need to do this for every type that you get back from the SoftLayer search service. And with this API call, we can see our response is a lot different. Our resource has hostname and ID, and for the both the same thing. And so in conclusion, object masks are what make the SoftLayer API so versatile. They can also be very confusing. So I hope this tutorial alleviated some of that confusion. And to think of the API model, it's essentially a huge ORM model. So if you understand how ORMs work, that should help you understand how the SoftLayer API works. Data types are all of those models that you have access to. And object masks are how you select the models that you want from an API result. And that's it for me. I hope you learned quite a lot about object masks, and thank you.